circulate this for folk who may want to see that. We also have a book available with about 46 stories, many of which we'll highlight on the tour. This is published by the Newgarden Cemetery Association. It's available for $10 if anyone's interested. So that's over here too. There are brochures available about the historic community of Newgarden and Guilford College if you want those. Well, welcome. This is quite a turnout. Glad I've got the speaker here. I'm Max Carter, member of Newgarden Friends Meeting and a member of the Newgarden Guilford College Alliance Board, which is sponsoring this tour along with the North Carolina Friends Historical Society. And we're delighted you could join us for this little romp through the graveyard. I hope you've got either sunscreen, water, or sunglasses, because it's going to be not quite a 3-hour tour like Gilligan's Island, but it's going to approach about 2 hours. So feel free to peel off, not just because you're sunburned, but because you have had enough of me anytime during the tour. But it'll be about approaching 2 hours, because there's a lot out there. And again, there are books available for $10 published by the Cemetery Association if you're interested in that. Brochures about the heritage community, and delighted to share this historic site with you. Just a couple, 3 things before we launch in. I know this is Memorial Day, and separate from Veterans Day, this is a time to honor those who fell sacrificially in times of war. Now, given it's a Quaker cemetery, you don't have an awful lot of that there. You do have some, but up through the Civil War, Quakers had a pretty uniform non-resistance pacifist testimony. We'll talk about how some deviated, shall we say, and certainly now there's not as tight a restriction, and Quakers follow their own conscience, their own light, in making their decision about their response to military service. We'll share a bit about that out there. But there are some interesting graves associated with those who've lost their lives in war. But in the, I grew up in Indiana, up north. Now, we're not Yankees in Indiana. Now, I was a Cubs fan. I hated the Yankees. But up north, while I was growing, it was called Decoration Day. And it was a day when we decorated the graves of family members and others. So in that spirit, we're going to decorate various graves as we highlight not only those who fell in war, but those who spent their lives working for peace and justice and equality, human rights. So there'll be a little bit of baseball and football tossed in there as well. I'll say just in the beginning, this cemetery began in 1757. Who are the Ballingers here? Where are the Ballingers? When their ancestor Henry Ballinger and Thomas Hunt, for the meeting, the Newgarden Friends meeting, purchased 53 acres from Richard Williams for the use of the meeting and a burial ground. And about half of that land is still under the control of Guilford College and the meeting. Part of it's on the campus of the college. A lot of it's here, the meeting house and the cemetery. Another half is Harris Teeter and Quaker Village. We'll say a little bit about how that happened as well. But thanks to the Ballingers, we have a graveyard out here. And we'll pass by the grave of Henry Ballinger when we go through the graveyard. Please ask questions. I know there are a lot of you who have close personal family ties to people buried here, so please feel free to share those stories, to ask questions, to correct me when I'm wrong on my details. We gave a tour, a brief tour, well, brief tour is an hour and 15 minutes, of the graveyard on Saturday as we talked about the historic connection of the Quaker community with the Woody side, an African American community just south of here. And I learned something I should have known before then, and I'll point it out when we get to the site of the little school. that serve the community. It's the footprint of that school is marked out by stones. I had never seen them before, and they're right there plain as day. So if there are facts that I missed that are plain as day, remind me of them, because I'm still learning. Okay, so if you're ready, we're going to do a kind of a clockwise tour starting at that corner. And again, please feel free to ask questions and to contribute, and off we go. Yeah, feel free to grab shade when you can. You recognize some people?
Well, my maiden name is McCain.
Oh, okay. Shake the family tree and the relic will probably fall out. Or some nuts.
That's right.
Well, I don't know, but it's the same thing. No, nothing's different about it.
Yeah, again, feel free to grab some shade. A few things about protocols on a Quaker graveyard. People often ask, don't worry about walking over Quaker graves. Quakers treat their cemeteries like parks. In fact, if you go to England, you'll find that most Quaker graveyards have been cleared of the stones, and the stones have been put around the walls, and the graveyard is literally treated as a park. Early on, as you'll see in the very middle of the graveyard, Quakers didn't even have stones. They felt that was a vain and worldly thing, and you shouldn't emphasize the body, but the light. And it wasn't until about 100 years later that Quakers even had stones in their graveyards. We kept records of where people were buried, but even George Fox, one of the founders of Quakerism, who died in 1691, was buried in the Dissenters' Nonconformist graveyard of Bunhill Fields outside of London, where good members of the Church of England wouldn't be buried. Nearby, all those Methodists who were also nonconformists and dissenters. Susanna Wesley, John Wesley, all those Wesleys are buried near the Quakers, not with the Quakers because the Methodists couldn't stand the Quakers. John Wesley was once asked about his belief in soul liberty, that all might be saved, which is very different from Calvinist understanding that only an elect would be saved. And the Calvinist said, what do you mean all might be saved? He said, I really mean that. All might be saved. And he said, even Quakers? And John Wesley said, one can never overestimate God's grace. But anyway, when George Fox was buried there was no marker. And a devotee of Fox came in later on secretly and placed a little stone that he had etched GF in, the initials for George Fox. And a better Quaker later on came in with a sledgehammer, smashed it to smithereens, because he just didn't do that. But as you can see, we've gotten over it. But anyway, feel free to walk wherever. The only whirring you'll be hearing won't be of people turning in their graves, but of the guy with the weed whacker. Somehow or other, every time we have a tour, they show up. This is true of my classes at Guilford too. As soon as I would start my classes, the weed whackers and the mowers would show up.
They
But
want to hear what you have to say.
that's right. I'll try to speak loudly enough. Well, anyway, as we begin, this is why it takes more than 2 hours. I want to start off by talking about the Fagans, Carol and Mary Fagans. Many of us here knew them. They were very active at Newgarden, both taught at Guilford College. And again, in the emphasis we're talking about today of people who sacrificed their lives in the service of human betterment, they met at Duke in the philosophy department. He was doing his PhD. I think Mary was doing her master's or undergraduate. They married, and he became a Quaker. Mary was raised Quaker. Carol wasn't, but he became a Quaker largely through his embracing the peace testimony. And he went on to Sullins College. Anyone ever heard of Sullins College in Bristol, Virginia? It's now defunct. I think it was a Methodist school. And he went there to teach philosophy at the beginning of World War II. As a conscience objector, he went to serve in the Civilian Public Service Corps. We'll talk about that later when we get to the Benford's graves. And the president of the Sullins College at the time said, while you're away doing your alternative service, Mary can stay in her apartment and you'll have a position when you come back. Well, when people in the town heard that they had one of those draft dodgers on the faculty, they raised such a ruckus, he was fired. Mary lost her apartment, but going up to the Civilian Public Service Corps work along the Blue Ridge Parkway out in western North Carolina, he got acquainted with Raymond Benford, former president of Guilford College, who was supervising with Helen that camp. And guess where they wound up? Teaching at Guilford College, where they worked very hard at interracial work. They'd done this in Sullins as well, bringing black students and white students together in the 1930s and 40s, which just wasn't heard of. Much of their career they devoted to international education as well. Took some of the first Guilford College foreign study programs to India, and in Southeast Asia in the 1960s they actually took a sabbatical from the college and organized conferences for young leaders of the different sides in that conflict to try to build a peaceful future in Southeast Asia. But in those trips, Carol picked up a terrible disease that afflicted him the rest of his life. And so, you know, he didn't die through that service, but it did deeply affect him. One last thing I'll say about Carol is that he was an expert organist. Any of you at friends' homes remember him doing organ concerts and playing music?
Played at my wedding.
Yeah, played at your wedding. In 1967, and we'll mention this World Gathering of Friends at the campus of Guilford College, a gathering of the world's Quakers, there was one time, there was such a large group that they had to go to the Coliseum because U Tant, the General Secretary of the United Nations, was speaking. He played the organ for that gathering, for U Tant. So anyway, if Quakers took their hats off, we would tip our hats to the Faganses. I do want to say a bit about Seth and Hazel Monsie's Macon. Some of you knew Seth and Hazel. Seth was a raised Quaker down in Randolph County, came to Guilford College, and back then, chapel was required. That didn't go out until the 1960s. And the way you took attendance to make sure that students were attending chapel in the old Memorial Hall was you were seated alphabetically. Well, Hazel Monsie's came as a basketball player, not on a scholarship, but came to play basketball. And Monsie's and Macon were seated next to each other in Old Assembly Hall, and obviously paid more attention to each other than whatever was going on in chapel. And married, and 67 years later, here they are. But he became chair of the Board of Trustees and a very strong contributor and supporter of the college. All righty, this way. Stay here in the shade.
What's about the Netflix stuff?
Because I want to say something about the Armfields. Now, neither of the Armfields I'm going to talk about are buried here in the Armfield plot, but William Armfield was a farmer here in the Newgarden community. Algie Newland's book about the Battle of Newgarden says it's not clear whether he was a member of the Quaker community before 1781 or after 1781, but anyway, this story is true. William Armfield was a farmer here, and like other farmers, his land had been ransacked by the armies of the British and the American rebels prior to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse and the Battle of Newgarden, March 15, 1781. So the morning of March 15, 1781, tired of all this, William Armfield gets up from the breakfast table, picks up his hunting rifle, heads out the door, and his wife asks him, "Where's he going?" "I'm going hunting." And off he went. Came back later on that evening, clearly having seen some action, put his gun back up on the rack, and his wife asked him, "Well, dear, where's thy game?" "I didn't shoot anything worth bringing home." He had obviously participated, as some others did. One of the most famous of the Quakers, who actually was a Quaker, but got disowned by the Cane Creek meeting for fighting in the War of Regulation in the 1770s. Colonel John Pyle was a medical doctor over in the Alamance County Quaker community, and he was a Tory because he'd been educated in his medical studies in London. So took the British side and headed up a militia of about 200 and some soldiers who in February of 1781 engaged Light Horse Harry Lee and his American troops in a battle that he woefully underestimated the strength of. And Pyle lost a third of his men. And Pyle himself was shot off of his horse. Saber slashed his face. He lost an eye. He lost some fingers. And he crawled into the Haw River and stayed in the Haw River until the battle was over. And then he crawled over to a pond and lay under the surface of the pond for a day and a half with only his nostrils protruding until he was sure that everyone had cleared out. Then he crawled home where he recuperated and went on to be tried for treason later on after the war was over. But he was pardoned because on the battlefield he had served both American and British soldiers who fell. So he was pardoned. We'll talk about that act as well later. So there were Quakers on both sides. Now the other Armfield I want to talk about, though, this, especially given our talk these days about racial understanding, about some of the history that we have to understand about race relations, is pretty sad. The Armfield family were Quakers, raised here in Guilford County, but some left Quakers and joined the Church of England and the Episcopal Church, either because they participated in the war and were disowned, or because when Quakers went anti-slavery in 1778, they wanted to hold on to their property. So left friends and went to churches that allowed that. So John Armfield was raised in one of those Armfield Quaker families, born in 1790s, just ahead of Levi Coffin, who we'll talk about later. Later on, John Armfield became the largest and wealthiest slave dealer in America. His firm, Franklin and Armfield, up in Alexandria, Virginia, dealt in thousands of human bodies annually. And he made so much money, he was one of the wealthiest people in America by the 1840s. And I don't want to step on any Episcopalian toes, but he founded the University of the South in Sewanee and endowed it with his slave money. So I'm sure they're dealing with some things right now, as many other institutions are. So there was mixed response, and we'll talk more about the mixed response of Quakers to slavery itself later on. Now, while all that's happening, while there are Quakers involved on both sides of the war, and William Armfield is gone hunting, down in the Center Friends meeting community on 62 in southern Guilford County, a meeting so old it's still spelled C-E-N-T-R-E, and it was the home meeting of Edward R. Murrow, for those of you who are old CBS journalist fans. There was one of the famous Jamestown rifle makers, Quakers were expert rifle makers at the time. There were about 22 gunsmiths in the Jamestown community and further out because people needed good rifles for hunting, keeping critters out of their cornfield. And Matthew Osborne was one of those expert gunsmiths. When he learned after the Battle of Newgarden and Guilford Courthouse that one of the guns he had sold to a neighbor had been used in the battles, he went to his neighbor, bought the gun back, and broke it so it would never be used that way again. All right.
Max, do you have to be Quaker to be buried here?
No, the question is, do you have to be Quaker to be buried here? You just have to be dead. But no, you don't have to be Quaker, but you have to have some tie, however distant. And we'll talk about some of those later on. But there has to be some sort of connection, but it's pretty loose. Okay, again, grab some shade if you can. I want to talk about Jonathan and Elizabeth Cox because they are largely responsible for the fact we still have a college over here. Jonathan Cox was one of the Board of Trustees members of Newgarden Boarding School. Newgarden Boarding School was established in 1837 to provide a place where Quakers could send their children for that guarded and religious education after so many Quakers had left the South for free states in the North. We went from about 20,000 Quakers in the South, Virginia through the Carolinas into Georgia around 1800 to fewer than 2,000 by the end of the Civil War, because Quakers adopted an anti-slavery stance in 1778, got involved in a lot of illegal activity we'll be talking about here, and there were economic reasons as well. They played out red clay and 100 years of bad farming before scientific farming. So deep loam in the north and the free states beckon, and the massive anti-slavery migrations we'll talk about later pretty much emptied the South of Quakers. And that meant all those old Quaker schools didn't have teachers, didn't have students, most of them closed down. And so Nathan Hunt and his education committee, the yearly meeting in 1831, said, we need to start a boarding school. It took them 6 years to get charted and raise the $4,500 necessary to build a school. And they opened in 1837 with 25 boys, 25 girls, more women on the faculty than men, the first coeducational school in the South. As that migration continued, Newgarden Boarding School was facing the same problem. Not enough teachers, not enough students. Already by the 1840s, they were allowing Methodists to come to that school. One of the first was Braxton Craven, who went on to have his strong connection with what's now Duke University. And by the beginning of the Civil War, the prospects were really dim, and the Board of Trustees decided to close the school, sell the property, pay off the $5,000 in debt they had, and be done with it. Jonathan Cox said, I can't let it happen. It's too important. I'll take the school on my own shoulders. And he recruited Nereus Mendenhall, principal of the school, to do the same. There's a wonderful story about Nereus and Oriana packing up and ready to go to North themselves, but while they were waiting down at the train station, said, you know, if we leave, the school will close. We can't do that. And unpacked and came back and lasted out the Civil War. The school remained open clear through the Civil War. One of the few schools that did so, because the young men didn't march off to fight. They hid back in the woods. We'll tell you more about that in a moment. And there were folk who stayed to keep it open, sacrificially, because it wasn't easy. So he got Nereus Mendenhall to stay as principal, taking the academic side on his shoulders. Jonathan took the boarding department on his shoulders. And throughout the Civil War, even while it was difficult to feed their own family, there wasn't a Harris Teeter distribution center nearby. Elizabeth and Oriana, the wife of Nereus, hung baskets of food back in the woods for anyone hiding out there. Fugitives from slavery, the boys who were hiding out there to escape the Confederate draft, and Confederate soldiers who had gone AWOL to hide out back there. That kept them fed clear through the war, even while students were foraging the surrounding cornfields. As the histories indicate, there were corn cobs piled to the second floor of old Founders Hall from students so hungry they foraged green corn from the surrounding field. But sacrificially kept that school open, and that's why we still have Guilford College. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Founders Hall is on the very footprint of the original building. As a duplicate, kind of.
I believe there was a Methodist preacher in this area by the name of Worth.
There was Worth
in
yeah.
the 1840s, early 1850s, who refused communion to a member who refused to denounce slavery.
Oh, really?
And
he must have been a Free Methodist or a Wesleyan Methodist.
He got
yeah.
driven out of the state. But
Yeah.
Just wondered if you were talking about Methodists being allowed in here in the 1840s.
Yeah, yeah.
There could have been any connection there.
Yeah, probably. Sure. Okay, anybody recognize these bricks? Boren bricks. Any of you know the Boren Brick Company that emerged out of the terracotta industry? Well, here's Addison Boren, the patriarch of that company. Addison Boren was born in the community. Again, it's unclear whether he was a member of the meeting, but at age 14, he had apprenticed with one of the Coffins to learn the proper kind of forging, blacksmithing. And his family, late 1830s, were packing up and heading to Indiana like other Quakers, but he remained behind because he was already apprenticed to, I think it was Elihu Coffin. And as his family piled on the wagon and headed north, his father tossed him a claw hammer and said, "Addison, this is all I can give thee. Make a life with it." And he remained behind, learning those skills. He helped make the bricks in 1837 for the school, and went on to have a farm where Kathleen Clay Edwards Library is now, Price Park. Later on we'll say they got that farm from the Coffins when they left. And he established a factory there making horse-drawn agricultural equipment. And his children then were hired by John Van Lindley, whose grave we'll visit soon, to drain his swampy nurseries where the Greensboro Arboretum is now. There's 100 acres of fruit trees of John Van Lindley. And how do they drain it? Terracotta pipe, because there's a lot of red clay here. And so you'll find terracotta piping all over the place. You go through Guilford College's campus and you'll see a lot of terracotta piping that's about 150 years old now. So they got some infrastructure problems. But then that developed into the brick industry, and that developed into the terracotta community. Any of you know the terracotta African-American community? Built around those factories over there around Norwalk, Spring Garden, where Expedex used to be. They blew up in the 1960s, but there's remnants of that community still there. Well, at the beginning of the Civil War, Addison Boren didn't want to get conscripted into the Confederate Army, so he walked to Indiana. We'll talk about some other folk who did that same thing. And 25 years after his family had left for Indiana, he decides it might be good to find out where they are in Indiana. So finds out where the home is, goes up to the front door, knocks on it. His mother answers and says, "Why, it's thee, little Addison." And anyway, after the war, came back here and established that great industry. Apologize, there's not a lot of shade here, but I want to point out George Swain. George Swain was one of 3 Quakers who went to bat for Benjamin Benson, who was a free black up in Delaware, kidnapped and sold into slavery to businessman John Thompson in Greensboro in 1816. Now George Swain, Enoch Macy, and Vestal Coffin, we'll talk about Vestal Coffin later on, were 3 ardent abolitionists. They were from Nantucket, and Nantucket had developed a very strong anti-slavery sentiment because they were sailors. They're all those whalers. They had seen the worst of the Middle Passage. They had seen the slave plantations. So they migrated here, many of them in 1772, because the whales were moving far offshore and war was coming, and they came and joined their Pennsylvania Quaker cohorts here in a community that was established largely by anti-slavery friends. Well, when they heard that Benjamin Benson had been sold into slavery and that he, knowing his rights, had gone to the court in Guilford County to sue for his freedom, they went to bat for him. That spooked John Thompson because he knew they meant business. As we'll see later, Vestal Coffin had formed the first manumission society in North Carolina. They had petitioned the legislature to end slavery, and they were activists. And so Thompson got spooked. He was going to lose his investment, sold Benjamin Benson to an enslaver in Georgia, and he was taken to Georgia. Macy, Coffin, and Swain kept at it and finally got him extradited back to Guilford County, where in 1820 he won his freedom through the court system. One of the first cases of that in American history. If you're familiar with the road maps and neighborhoods of East Greensboro, there's a Benjamin Benson neighborhood over just east of Bennett College near A&T, and through the Benjamin Benson neighborhood runs John Demery Road, and we'll talk about John Demery later on. He was the first passenger on the Underground Railroad. Vestal and Alethea Coffin were the first conductors. So a lot of connections there. But he later on became the president of the Colonization Society in Guilford County, an organization finding those who wanted to leave the slave culture and go back to Africa, Haiti, Sierra Leone, or down to the Caribbean. And he organized shiploads of folk after interviewing the captains to make sure that they were scrupulous. But by 1825, realized that wasn't working because there were unscrupulous sea captains who sold their cargoes into slavery, and the situation back there wasn't conducive. So he resigned that position, but remained in the community as a medical doctor until his death in 1852. We'll get you into some shade now. Grab some shade. Can you still hear me? Is it okay? I'm just going to point to the grave of John Van Lindley. Now there's Lindley everywhere around Greensboro. What did PTI used to be called? Lindley Field, because Lindley had nurseries out there. There's a Lindley Road up here. There's a Lindley School. There's the Lindley neighborhood where the Arboretum is. John Van Lindley was raised in the Newgarden Quaker community, a member of Newgarden meeting, and during the Civil War, as an ardent anti-slavery activist who knew that he wouldn't be treated well if drafted into the Confederate Army, headed to Missouri and joined the Union Cavalry and survived that, came back and was one of those Yankees welcomed back into the community and to the Newgarden Quaker community, where he became a really prominent business person and philanthropist. His father's nursery business had fallen into bankruptcy, and he got it out of bankruptcy by studying and practicing scientific pomology, fruit growing. And eventually had about 1,000 acres of nurseries around North Carolina. He's the guy who introduced peaches to the Sandhills. He also was a commissioner in Guilford County and emphasized good roads for good business. He started a financial enterprise and eventually joined some other financial enterprises, and today it's Lincoln Financial. He hired farmers out of season to make brooms, had a broom factory going on. A tremendous contributor to the local community. As we know, hired those Boren boys to drain his nursery, leading to the terracotta and brick industry. So hats off, again, if Quakers did such things, to John Van Lindley. He died in 1918. His son, Paul, became mayor of Greensboro. Okay, stay in the shade.
I'm sorry.
There's a lot of significance here. Can you hear me?
I'm sorry.
Okay?
Sorry.
Here's the first president of Guilford College, Lewis Lyndon Hobbs, graduated from the boarding school, and like all good Orthodox Gurneyite Quakers, went to Haverford up in Philadelphia, not Swarthmore. Swarthmore was Hicksite. And no Gurneyites or Hicksites would mix and mingle. So he went up to Haverford and got his education and came back not only with an education, but also with a passion for a game derived from the fact that Haverford, to this day, plays cricket. What's the derivative of cricket? Baseball. It's said by some historians he's the first person to introduce baseball south of the Mason-Dixon. Mason-Dixon, by the way, was surveyed by a couple of Quakers. Now, what are you going to do if no one else is playing baseball? He had organized a great baseball team called the Hobbs Hollow Boys at the boarding school in Guilford College, but he had to recruit communities and mills to have baseball teams. So part of the reason that Guilford became such a hotbed of baseball by the early 1900s, we'll talk about that later with the Farrell boys, is largely because of Lewis Lyndon Hobbs, and he became the first president of Guilford. His wife, Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, was the daughter of Nereus and Oriana. So she lasted out the Civil War, and if you go into the archives at Guilford, her essays and recollections about surviving the Civil War are amazing, about what it took to make it through. She talked one time very movingly about how her husband, her father, Nereus, a passionate scholar, he was an academic, he was an engineer. He helped engineer the Carolina Railroad through Guilford County, and that's why we have High Point. High Point was the highest point on the Carolina Railroad. And he was a medical doctor, and he read voraciously. But during the Civil War, you couldn't get oil for your lamps. He would go out hunting possums and render their fat down to try to make, crude lamp oil. Didn't work very well, so that was one of the things he had to give up. But anyway, her recollections of that are really important in understanding the situation of the Civil War. She went on to education up north in New York, Howland School. The Howlands were the folk who put Newgarden Boarding School over the top by giving the final $1,000 contribution to raise the $4,500 to start the school in 1837. She went to the Howland School, where her classmate was M. Carey Thomas. Anyone know M. Carey Thomas? Second president of Bryn Mawr, who made Bryn Mawr a national institution. And anyway, became a passionate advocate for women's education. Coming back here and traveling with her husband around the state, she recognized that long after the Civil War, there was no money in the economy, and families weren't sending their girls to get an education. They were investing in their boys. Girls were just going to get married, raise children. Why waste an education on a girl? That didn't pass muster with Mary Mendenhall Hobbs. So she organized a scholarship committee to provide scholarships for girls to attend Newgarden Boarding School and Guilford College. Eventually, they had enough money to build cottages on the women's side, the girls' side of campus, where they could work their way through school at a reduced cost and learn modern home economics. And in 1907, they had enough money to build a purpose-built women's cooperative residence hall for 55 girls to work their way through school and learn modern home economics. It's still Mary Hobbs Hall. Until 1999, was still a women's cooperative residence hall. They couldn't get the girls to do the work. They had to clean bathrooms and cook. The cook there, Miss Kathy, was from Woodyside, which we'll talk about later. That historic connection with the African-American community we'll talk about at the Woody Graves and Guilford College. She was also a strong advocate for public education for women. So along with DeWitt Benbow, Charles McIver, Mary Woody, and other Quakers in the community, she helped organize a committee and petition the state legislature to start a women's college, which became Women's Industrial and Normal College, then Women's College, now UNCG. So she's involved with that as well. Also a strict advocate for opposition of capital punishment. She opposed World War I, and she promoted the teaching of evolution in the science department of the college in the 1800s, which kept the science department at Guilford College from being destroyed by those religious wars that destroyed the science departments of so many other colleges. And she was very strong in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. That again is what we'll talk about with Mary Woody, who founded the WCTU here in the Benbow House downtown. The WCTU was not just about temperance, it was also about women's empowerment. Because what was alcohol doing to families? What was alcohol doing to husbands? And that organization empowered a lot of women in leadership. So anyway, Mary Mendenhall Hobbs. Now stay there, right here. Clyde Milner and Ernestine Milner, who studied under Clyde and Ernestine. How many had her cucumber punch? Okay, very famous for her cucumber punch. Temperance, remember, temperance. Clyde Milner was president of the college from 1934 to 1965, the longest serving president. During his presidency, during World War II, he was approached by the American Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia with the concern that there were all of these Japanese American students interned in concentration camps who wanted to continue their education. Would Guilford accept some of them? The faculty said yes, and 9 Japanese American students came and studied at Guilford College. Same thing happened at Scattergood, at Earlham, Haverford, the other Quaker schools. Now, they weren't overly welcome off campus, shall we say. He was spat on and cussed at downtown when he made trips, but they were well integrated into the campus life. 3 played basketball. Now, they were not the centers. They were little shooting guards, but excellent members of the basketball team. 1 was on the football team. And the coach told him, now when we play off campus, if anyone asks you about your ethnicity, just tell them you're Cherokee. Because that passed, but not being Japanese American. Many of you remember Benford Farlow. Benford Farlow, who graduate of Guilford College, member of Jamestown meeting, and just passed away a couple years ago, living over friends' homes. He was on that basketball team. And he relates stories of leaving places like what's now Appalachian State, stopping at a diner to get a bite to eat. And when they saw that they were Japanese Americans, they were not welcome. And they had to get the heck out of there with a long line of headlights following them out of Watauga County to make sure that they got back to Greensboro. But again, well integrated into the campus. Now at the same time, during World War II, Kurt and Gertrude Victorious came to Guilford. How many of you remember Kurt and Gertrude? Any of you take their classes? Dr. Vicky, you have a class with Dr. Vicky? He was a chief economist in Nazi Germany. Not a Nazi, but he was in Nazi Germany as the head economist of the German National Banking Association. Born Jewish, he had married a Christian, Gertrude, that joined the National Church to try to have that layer protected. That doesn't work in Nazi Germany. So in 1939, the American Friends Service Committee helped them get out of Germany. I won't go into all the details, some of it's in the book, about how Quakers had remained after World War I and their feeding program of starving German children witnessed the rise of Nazism and organized an attempt to get Jews out of Germany in 1938 that was accepted by the Gestapo. Amazing story. And they got thousands out before the war started in September of '39, including Bruno Bettelheim, the famous psychologist, faculty at any number of Quaker colleges around the country, and Kurt and Gertrude Victorious, who came here. He became the head of our economics department. And their retirement home, one of the retirement homes was along Francis King Street, then eventually built a home on campus, still known as Victorious House, two houses in from the campus lake. Students think it's one of our rare victories in the ODAC, but it was really named after the Victorious family. Now the other thing, stay there, that we'll talk more about when we get to Pete and Lucretia Moore's graves. It was in 1962, under Clyde Milner's presidency, that Guilford integrated. Guilford remained segregated until 1962. But Clyde was going to retire in 1965, and he wanted, as the last feather in his broad-brimmed hat, to be getting the 1967 every 15 years gathering of worldwide Quakers to happen on campus. Remember Utant, Carol Fagan? And that wasn't going to happen when half the world's Quakers live in Kenya. Quakers of color were not going to gather on a segregated campus in the segregated South. So Pete Moore, some other faculty, and Clyde Milner hatched up a scheme. They went to Kenya, recruited 2 Kenyan Quakers to come and enroll in the spring of 1962. And the sky didn't cave in. They then quietly brought in James McCorkle that fall, the first African-American student in Guilford integrated. So a lot of contributions to diversity under Clyde Milner. Hey, glad to be in the sun a little bit. Oh, thank you.
Max, was there a connection with the president with Charlotte Hawkins Brown as well? Because that was about the same time as McKeever.
I don't know those connections. I know we talked a bit about that at Woodyside on Saturday. Theresa Meacham was going to go to Charlotte Hawkins Brown, but she couldn't go to Guilford or the segregated schools here. But there wasn't room at Charlotte Hawkins Brown Palmer Institute. She wound up at the Lutheran school downtown. But I'm not sure about the other connections here. We will talk about a connection with what's now Winston-Salem State, though, and A&T and Benham. Okay, somewhere here is the unmarked grave of Richard Williams. His family says it's here somewhere. Richard Williams farmed what's now this, Guilford College, Harris Teeter, Quaker Village, all that land. You got big parcels of land back then. And in 1757, he sold 53 acres of that farm to the meeting for the purpose of their meeting house and their burial ground. In the battles of Newgarden, March 15, 1781, that we'll talk about in a moment at this grave over here, hundreds of soldiers fell in the skirmishes here that preceded the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. There was a skirmish up at what used to be the entrance to the Jefferson Pilot Country Club. There's a major skirmish here. There's a major skirmish at the crossroads, Ballinger, Fleming, and Newgarden. Each of those places, soldiers fell and were buried. And in a moment, we'll talk about 125 to 150 buried here. But hundreds of others fell in farmland, in the pasture fields, croplands around, and several fell on the Williams farm. And Richard Williams attended to one of the British officers. Historians believe it was Tarleton, the lieutenant to Cornwallis, who lost 3 fingers, we know, in the battle. And in the records of Richard Williams, it said that the British officer they attended to had a hand wound. So, could be. Contracted smallpox from Tarleton and died a few weeks later. He was buried. So a casualty of war assisting those who had fallen in war. This marker, you can tell a Quaker graveyard because you've got markers for trees. But this is not just any tree. This is the Revolutionary oak. Hundreds, again, were wounded in those battles, March 15, 1781. We'll talk later on about how the meeting house was used as a field hospital. It was packed full. Hundreds of others were laid out on pallets of wood throughout the graveyard, many of them underneath this tree, which had sprouted in 1492. So by 1781, it was massive. And ever after, it was known as the Revolutionary oak. It became the iconic symbol of this community. 1955, the American Friends Service Committee, if you've heard about them before, is working to integrate public schools. They'd given up on Guilford. Guilford's Board of Trustees had a chair who was mayor of Greensboro, chair of A&T, chair of Guilford and a slum landlord, he wasn't going to integrate. So Quakers turned their efforts towards public schools. And as part of that, Eleanor Roosevelt came and spoke to an integrated audience sitting in the old meeting house, now Newgarden Hall, on campus. A steamy June night in 1955, she's speaking, and on Saturday, during our brief hour and 15-minute tour, 2 people who were there spoke about their memories. While she was speaking, there was a large blast. They didn't know what it was at the time, but afterwards they found out that that blast that shook the building, rattled the windows, and caused Eleanor Roosevelt to pause briefly in her speech was dynamite set at the base of this tree while she was speaking and set off. No one knew at the time whether this was KKK, whether this was folk upset by this promiscuous mingling of the races, as it was called. But later on, I know someone at Friend's home still alive, 100 years of age, says, I know who they were. There were 3 bad boys. And she knows the names. I will not divulge them. She told me not to, or her name either. But anyway, it so damaged the tree that it fell in a storm, one of the hurricanes, 4 years later. Being good Quakers, they turned it into furniture. There's furniture all over this place and in the meeting house. And just recently, after maybe 2 years ago, the recent interim president of Guilford, Jim Hood, a marvelous woodworker, turned some of that remaining wood that we still have into a mantelpiece, a lovely mantelpiece over the fireplace in a new coffee shop on campus. So some of that wood's still around, but there are tables and chairs and picture frames and gavels and all kinds of stuff all through the Quaker community from that tree. Okay, stay in the shade. I want to point out a couple things. Ever heard of Henry Ballinger? Here he is. Much later gravestone put there by the Ballinger family. That he was one of the 2 Quakers who bought the land from Richard Williams. So here's your ancestor. Now the Henry Ballinger was French. Henri Ballinger. They were Huguenots, Protestants who fled France after the Edict of Nantes was revoked, eventually became Quakers like many Huguenots did, including Anthony Benezet and others, and wound up here. And there were still a lot of Ballingers along Ballinger Road. And Ballinger Road is the old stagecoach road that connected this area with Salisbury and points west. And the Ballingers had an inn along that stagecoach route that George Washington ate at during his southern tour to look at the battlefields. We don't know if he slept there, but we know he ate there. And supposedly wood from that old inn is incorporated into the Ballinger house that stands on Ballinger Road today, built in the 1850s. So some of those timbers are from the old inn. And there's a table, supposedly, that has cleaver marks in it in the Ballinger family. So you don't know who has it now, but there's some of those artifacts around. But old Henry Ballinger. Now stay in the shade. You get a chance to look at this, you'll get a chance to see how Quakers made their gravestones after they were allowed to. First of all, they were just little stones they scratched initials in, and then they got a little larger and you could have the name and birth and death date. But this one, from the Unthanked family, they didn't have enough money to hire a proper engraver. So if you take a look, it's broken off. You can see the Unthanked, the ends are backwards. They forgot the H, they had to come back later, put a little caret, put an H up there. Just very primitive. That's how earlier gravestones look. And the main thing I want to point out are these graves. They're on the cover of the little book about the cemetery. This is William and Priscilla Coffin. And their epitaphs indicate, proudly born in Nantucket. They're among those Nantucket Quakers who came here. You know, the coffee names, the Folgers, the Starbucks, the department store folk, the Macy's, and the Coffins, Swains, and others. These are Levi Coffin's grandparents. If you know anything about Levi Coffin, later on became known as the president of the Underground Railroad. When he and his wife Catherine and their family moved to Indiana in 1826, having grown up here, he left when he was 28, so he was formed in the Newgarden community. They established a home north of Richmond, Indiana, a town we'll talk about later, established by 3 Quakers from Randolph County in 1806. Their home became known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad, and between 2,000 and 3,000 fugitives from slavery went through that home alone on one of 3 major routes through Indiana to Canada on the Underground Railroad. But other things significant about the Coffins other than their grandson. As you see, William Coffin is an honorary son of the American Revolution. Now that whirring sound you hear in the background is him turning in his grave, because he was one of those Quaker pacifists. But their farm adjoined the Richard Williams farm. It's about where Western Guilford High School is now. So during those battles of March 15, soldiers fell on their land as well. And like the Williams and like the other Quakers here, they took them in, nursed them, and because they helped American soldiers who fell in those battles, he was made an honorary son of the American Revolution. The local chapter had to admit they helped British soldiers too, but since he helped Americans, he qualifies. Now, interestingly enough, I don't know, there's no record that they caught smallpox, but another Quaker, besides Richard Williams, who died of smallpox, contracted from a soldier, Nathan Hunt, who founded Newgarden Boarding School, now Guilford College, was a young man helping in those efforts on his farm, and he contracted smallpox too, but he survived. Had he died, who knows where we would have that little institution over there. So anyway, the Coffins. Now, briefly, we're going to go over to the mass grave. You can stay here in the shade. I'm just going to point it out, and I hope you can hear from me.
Max, is
Yeah.
there any connection between this Unthank and Harmon Unthank in Warnersville?
Probably. Harmon Unthank was the mayor of Warnersville, a black, an African American, who worked with Yardley Warner, who is an ancestor of Jim Hood, who I mentioned earlier on, and all those Hoods and folk who went to Guilford. Yardley Warner was a member of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting Freedmen's Aid Society after the Civil War. And he was dispatched by Philadelphia Quakers to come down to the South after the Civil War, see what he could do for recently emancipated blacks. Now, one of the things that he did, as the Woodies did and other Quakers did, was he realized that there were whites who wouldn't sell blacks land. So he purchased a large tract of land just south of downtown Greensboro. It's where Florida Avenue goes through now off of Elm, Eugene, and made it available for blacks. And it became known as Warnersville. And the unofficial mayor of Warnersville was Harmon Unthank, who plotted it out, helped sell the plots. Now, he was not a Quaker, but the Unthank name was very Quaker. You could, back then Quakers were endogamous. You married in, so you could tell pretty much it was Quaker by the surname. And Unthank was one of those. My wife and I live on the old Unthank farm, just a mile west of here. That indicates that before 1778, Quakers were enslavers. So there was probably, an Unthank enslaver, and Harmon Unthank probably descended from that. Any of you football fans, we'll talk about football later on too. Any of you remember the name Rashad Mendenhall? The star running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers, an All-American at University of Illinois. George Mendenhall was a Quaker who freed the enslaved persons that he inherited from his wife when she died. Now, he was disowned for marrying a non-Quaker and for remaining an enslaver while he was married to her. But as soon as she died, he married Delphina Mendenhall, who John Greenleaf Whittier said she was a quarter of the meeting under herself. And she said, you ain't going to continue to do that. And so he educated them, gave them trades, and personally escorted them to Indiana to be free. Those who were re-enslaved or kidnapped, he went back and rebought and trained them, got them back in. And he died drowning in the deep river on one of those missions. But again, some of those blacks adopted the name Mendenhall, and later on Rashad Mendenhall becomes the star running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers. When Shawn Rogers, who was the director of Mendenhall Home Place, how many of you have been to Mendenhall Home Place? You've seen that false bottom wagon. They're rolling the Underground Railroad. He was trying to get Rashad Mendenhall to come and do a program talking about it. At the time, Mendenhall Home Place was still called Mendenhall Plantation. It was never a plantation in that sense of the word, but it got that name because it was a large tract of farmland. He got Rashad Mendenhall on the phone, and when he answered, Shawn said, "It was a mistake." I said, "This is Shawn Rogers. I'm the director of the Mendenhall Plantation." Click. He wasn't he had that association, but had probably forgotten the history. My favorite story of that is of Elton Trueblood. Now, some of you may know Elton Trueblood, who began his academic career at Guilford College in the 1920s. Famous Quaker author, philosopher, taught at Earlham for many, many years. His granddaughter was recently on the board of trustees at Guilford. Elton knew that he was descended from Truebloods who came from Perquimans County, eastern North Carolina, which used to be a large center of Quakerism. In fact, this is the 350th anniversary of the first Quaker communities emerging in Perquimans and Pasquotank counties in 1672. And wherever Elton Trueblood went to speak, and I know Catherine has met Elton and probably has any number of stories of old Elton, that wherever he would speak with an unusual name like his, and he spoke all over the world, in America, he would go to the hotel room after his talk, get a phone book, look up Truebloods and see if there were any Truebloods, and would call one of them up at random just because we're bound to be related. So he was speaking in Perquimans County many years ago. He died in 1995. And after his talk, went to the motel, gets a phone book. Remember phone books? Looked up, found lots of Truebloods. He said, of course, because the Truebloods came from here and migrated to Indiana. So I'm bound to find some. Picks one out at random, calls them up, and Elton had a distinctive, deep, sonorous voice. He said, "Well, hello, this is your long-lost cousin, Elton Trueblood." Long pause at the end of the line, and the voice comes back, "Pardon me, but you sound white." Truebloods were enslavers. Many of them picked up the surname as well. So that's probably where the unthanked comes from.
Thank you.
Okay, this is why it takes 2 to 3 hours. So let me go over here and I'll point out the mass grave and then come back here and explain it. Right here. Can you hear me from here? Okay, March 15, 1781, we've had several weeks of competing armies foraging the surrounding countryside, and eventually the forward pickets of the American and the British armies meet in 3 major skirmishes here in the Newgarden Quaker community. The first skirmish, dawn of March 15, is up at the former entrance to the country club, the Jefferson Standard Country Club. After that skirmish, the British under Tarleton retreated along a road you can still see a trace of through the Guilford College campus. Starts off of Newgarden Road at King Hall, goes between the baseball and football fields where you can see an indentation, and through the Newland Woods where you can still see a trace of it. Came back and re-engaged the American troops here around the meeting house, in the cemetery, in the farmlands, and eventually the third skirmish was up at the crossroads, Ballinger, Newgarden, and Fleming, where there are about 24 British buried somewhere in there who fell. One of whom was plugged by a hunt boy, a 15, 16-year-old Quaker boy who had been out hunting. And as he came out of the woods, saw a British Army officer riding out of the woods on his horseback and plugged him. So he wasn't probably a member of the meeting yet as a young boy, so he couldn't be disowned. But it wasn't Nathan Hunt, we know that. But anyway, after the battles of Newgarden and Guilford Courthouse, now the Battle of Newgarden lasted 3 hours. Guilford Courthouse lasted maybe 2 hours. Historians believe that the British were so exhausted and bloodied by their skirmishes here that they were affected in their battles up there at Guilford Courthouse. So it had some impact on the outcome of that, which the British technically won, but had to retreat and lick their wounds in Hillsborough, allowing the American troops to rebuild and re-strengthen, and it led to Yorktown directly. Well, after the battles, both sides just left their dead and wounded on the battlegrounds, assuming the Quakers would take care of them, and they did. And as we know, some contracted smallpox, some died, but they had to bury the dead immediately because of camp fever and smallpox. So according to Mary Mendenhall Hobbs's records and her recollections from talking to old geezers in the community when she was a little girl, they dug 3 trenches here and buried the dead, British and American, together as a sign of their brotherhood in death, even though they fought in life. And this marks where those trenches were. So somewhere between 125 and 150 British and American soldiers are buried there. Now we'll get back into the shade. And I want to point out a fairly significant woman. You come over this way. Yep. If you're familiar with the 2 white frame houses on front campus at Guilford, those are the Worth houses. There are a bunch of historical markers in front of them now. Levi Coffin, Vina Curry, Guilford College, Underground Railroad. Those are in front of those 2 white frame houses. Those were farmhouses of the Worth family. Rhoda and Laura were raised there. Their father moved from Alamance County, again, to have access to better education here, as many other Quakers did. Laura went on after Newgarden boarding school to become a trained nurse, one of the first women to get education up in Philadelphia as a nurse. Came back and served Guilford and other colleges in the community. And during World War I, during the Spanish influenza epidemic, she advised the college in how to deal with the epidemic, quarantining, restricting folks' movement, and she got the college clear through the epidemic without the loss of a single student. There were students who left campus and died elsewhere, but those who stayed on campus because of Laura survived. She went on to become an amazing genealogist. If any of you are genealogists and know the Henshaw genealogies, she did all the research in North Carolina records for the Henshaw genealogies. Pretty amazing woman. So again, thanks to her. Now the Worth family has another couple famous folk. After the Civil War, Quaker Jonathan Worth from Asheboro became the first governor of the Reconstruction era, Republican governor. And he's buried elsewhere. But his grandson you may have heard of, William Sidney Porter O. Henry, was a descendant from them. Okay, again, stay in the shade when you can. You can see this when you pass by. But there are many favorite epitaphs I have in cemeteries. And one of my favorite is, I told you I was sick. There's one that W.C. feels is actually not true, but reportedly was, I'd rather be here than in Philadelphia. But this is right up there on the list. William Thomas Parker, born at Belvedere, Perquimans County, where Quakerism began in North Carolina, November 21, 1861, died at High Point, 1922. A lifelong friend, but never a pacifist. Yeah. Now, I only learned a few months ago that William Thomas Parker was the ancestor of my uncle Wayne Carter, who's still alive, was pastor at Winston-Salem Friends Meeting for a long time. He was the ancestor of his wife Betsy Parker, who grew up in Perquimans County. Then the family moved to Baltimore, where she went to school, and they went to Bryn Mawr College, Orthodox Gurneyite College. And their farm that went down through the Parker lineage is now the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard facility in Perquimans County. But I want to say a bit about Belvedere. Belvedere is a little town, still a little town in Perquimans County, that got its name from the Thomas Newby plantation of Belvedere. That house is still standing. It was a slave plantation. The Newbys, again, were enslavers, like Quakers out there in plantation country were, until 1778. Well, it was Thomas Newby who went to his meeting in the early 1770s saying, I can't in any good conscience continue to enslave people. What do I do? It's against the law to free your enslaved persons. So through the 1770s, Quakers in North Carolina, as they were up north, were wrestling with their history of involvement with slavery, and finally came to the understanding you can't be a Quaker and enslaver at the same time. So Thomas Newby at Belvedere had a deep influence on North Carolina Quakers becoming anti-slavery and adopting that stance in 1778. Well, that Belvedere plantation and its house descended through Newby descendants, and Lucy Newby today still lives there in her 90s, the widow of Wolfman Jack, who is buried next door. Now, you're a crowd, unlike my students at Guilford, who had some recognition of who Wolfman Jack was. When I would point that out on tours with Guilford students, I'd say, Wolfman Jack died in that plantation house in 1995. They say, who's he? He says, well, he was an American graffiti. What's that? That's when I realized I needed to retire. That, along with the fact I realized my beard was older than their parents. So anyway, William Thomas Parker. Stay there in the shade if you can. I just want to point out very quickly Hugh Moore. Hugh Moore is essentially why we have a Dana Auditorium, a Dana Lounge, and Dana Scholarships at Guilford. Hugh Moore was a graduate of Guilford, worked as a fundraiser for the American Friends Service Committee. In the 1950s, he was making a call on an industrialist, the CEO of what's now Perfect Circle Piston Rings, a major automobile manufacturer, a guy by the name of Charles Dana. And Charles Dana says, I don't give money to institutions that don't build buildings and name them after me. So he wasn't going to give money for relief work. But Hugh Moore said, I know exactly the person you need to talk to. Phoned up, so the legend has it, Clyde Milner, said, you got to get on a train and come to New York right now. I mean, this is part of the legend. But anyway, Hugh Moore hitched up Clyde Milner, president of the college, and Charles Dana, and they formed a fast friendship. And Dana poured money into Guilford College, as he did to Agnes Scott, a number of other small, struggling southern colleges. And that's why we get Dana Auditorium. Now, students, when it was dedicated, really wanted it named after Clyde Milner, their beloved president for so many years, approaching retirement. But Dana insisted, it's going to be named after me. So on the day it was dedicated, with the Dana family there and Charles Dana present, students climbed up on the roof and unfurled a banner proclaiming it to be Milner Hall. Now we now have a Milner Hall, but it's a dormitory. But the interesting thing is Charles Dana made his money making transmissions for World War II Army tanks. So the military got recycled into at least building a little Quaker college. We also got one other thing, and I know Theresa knows where this picture is. We only got money from Charles Dana for scholarships, for the auditorium, for the old Dana Lounge. We got a portrait of Mrs. Dana. I forget what her first name was, but anyway, Mrs. Dana. And when I first saw it, it was in Dana Lounge. And it was the oddest portrait. She was like this. I asked Charles Hendricks, I said, what's the story with that portrait? He said, well, when we got it, socialite New York that she was, she had a cigarette holder, a long cigarette, and a champagne glass, and it got airbrushed out. Where is that picture now? Is it an advancement? Used to be an advancement.
Long gone.
Yeah. Theresa is the art archivist at Guilford, now retired, I think, but knows all the art over there. Okay, we'll be in the sun a little bit. Those of you who are athletics fans, just to the right now for me, left for you, of Hugh Moore's grave are the Dokes family graves. The Dokes were graduates of Guilford, went on to coach baseball, basketball at Elon, Duke, NC State, famous in North Carolina athletics. So they're described in that book as well. How many have been to the Levering Orchard? Sweet cherries come ripe June 1st. Tart cherries a week later, so head up there. The Levering Orchard was established by George Levering's brother, Ralph Levering, in 1908. He walked the Blue Ridge for 200 miles looking for the ideal spot for raising fruit. Family lore has it that he was a strawberry farmer in eastern Tennessee and was tired of bending over and wanted to spend the rest of his life reaching to the stars. So found out through some brochures from the agricultural department where the ideal thermal belt was in the Blue Ridge, found that spot just north of Mount Airy and established the Levering Orchard. George went on to be a Quaker missionary, established a Quaker meeting and school in Ciudad Victoria in Mexico, and left with his wife Emily and their 4 small children during the Revolution. Became a pastor up in Ohio and then became pastor of the Ashboro Street Friends Meeting, now First Friends. During World War I, he preached against buying war bonds, good Quaker that he was, and got hounded out of town by his own congregation and editorials in the local paper, and died of a massive heart attack on R&R up at the Orchard in 1919. Left his wife Emily destitute because Ashboro Street didn't have insurance, didn't have any kind of savings for them, and so she went to work as the matron of Mary Hobbs Hall and ran that women's dormitory that you heard about earlier, that women's quarterly dorm, as her nephew George White said, like a Marine Corps sergeant. There's a famous story about how back in the day women had a curfew. 9:30 they had to be in bed and the dorms were locked. Men weren't locked in because if you lock in the women, of course the men will just file back to their dorms. We all know that worked, didn't it? But the girls knew that at 9:30 at curfew she would make the rounds and she'd be checking to see if they were in. Well, 2 girls decided that we're going to sneak out and use the graveyard for other purposes than burying dead people. Very popular spot for boys and girls at Guilford College to meet back in the day. And knowing that Emily was going to be checking, put pillows under the blankets in their room and snuck out and after whatever over here at the graveyard, snuck back in, took their shoes off, creeped up the stairs, down the hall, quietly opened the door, and Emily sprung out of their bed, having nabbed them. Getting some shade here. He's not. Yeah, he went to Palestine twice with us. Wonderful guy. He's not buried here. I'm not sure where he is. I'll have to ask him. Theresa, do you know where Alex Stosen's buried? He's not here.
No, I don't know. I thought he was buried here.
Yeah, I don't believe he is. Nancy Sism is. Yeah. Okay, no, we can't hit everything. I do want to point out Skipper Bowles is buried down here. Some of you may remember Skipper Bowles, gubernatorial candidate. His son Ernestine Bowles was chief of staff for Clinton. He's down there in the corner. The Bowles family were Quakers from way back. I wanted to point out Jack Jensen. Some of you may know Jack Jensen's fame athletically. Longtime coach at Guilford College. One of the only college coaches in America to win national championships in 2 sports. He won the NAIA national championship in basketball in 1973 with 4 future NBA players. Back when small colleges could sneak out folk from Brooklyn and elsewhere under the noses of the biggies. He had World B. Free, I'm forgetting the Boston Celtics guy. It'll come to me, it's heck getting old.
Brett Maxwell?
No.
Casey Jones?
Nope, it was Greg Jackson and, oh God, the guy who waved the towel made Larry Bird so angry. It'll come to me eventually, but anyway, had 4 future NBA players on it. Then went on to win 2 national championships in golf, even though he didn't play golf. He was just a great recruiter and a great motivator, but buried here, died of a heart attack coming back from a golf match in 2010. Usually there are golf balls and basketballs scattered around here, as you'll see baseballs scattered around the Farrell graves. Okay, I'm not going to claim that John Coltrane is buried here. But John Coltrane went to a Quaker school, at least a school descended from an industrial school in Ashboro started by New York Quakers after the Civil War for those recently emancipated. That industrial school started by New York Quakers eventually moved to High Point where it became the William Penn School. And that's where John Coltrane went to school, but he's not here. Do we still have any Mackies with us? There was a... Okay. There's a Mackey from Yadkin County among us, and here's some more Mackies. Wade and Salma Mackey were very involved in efforts through the American Friends Service Committee for integration in the South. American Friends Service Committee sent Wade and Selma down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1957. That's the year that the AFSC recruited Josephine Boyd from Dudley High School, senior girl at Dudley High School, to integrate what's now Grimsley High School. She was trained and recruited by the AFSC in 1957. Josephine Boyd Bradley is now the name of the former Aycock Road that goes past Grimsley and UNCG for those efforts. The one sole black student in 1957 at what's now Grimsley. Well, that same year, Wade is sent down to Baton Rouge to work on integration. He sets up an office on the seam between the white and black neighborhoods and brings white and black community members together in efforts that eventually led to the integration of public schools there. But it wasn't overly popular. And in fact, he had a wiretap from his home to the superintendent of education in Baton Rouge, who kept listening in to see what these Quakers were up to. Eventually, in 1969, they retire, move back here to Greensboro. He dies in 1971. Selma continues on the board of the Bienville Center for Peace and Justice that grew out of that work. And there's a Wade Mackey Award every year, established in 1987 for peace and justice workers, one of whom was Helen Prejean, the Catholic nun, Dead Men Walking, Father Roy Bourgeois, many others have received the Wade Mackey Peace and Justice Award. Yeah. Okay. M.L. Carr, thank you, yes. M.L. Carr. I don't know how I could forget it. He was on the board of trustees for all those years.
Bob Coffin and Greg Jackson.
Yeah. Bob Coffin was just before that, but yeah.
He was, yes.
Yeah, M.L. Carr and the World Be Free. Wasn't a bad team. I can't believe they lost 5 games that year.
I know, yeah.
You're wise. Stand in the shade. Okay, again, you'll notice on Memorial Day in a Quaker graveyard, there aren't an awful lot of flags flying for the reasons we talked about. There is one here. Mary Nicholson was raised in that Ashboro Street meeting. Her pastor was George Levering. As a young woman in the 1920s, she learned how to fly and became the first commercial licensed pilot woman in North Carolina. Got a historical marker for her out here on Friendly. She went barnstorming out of old Lindley fields, flying out of Lindley fields for many years, and then was in the beginnings of the organization called the 99s. These were 99 of the 117 licensed women pilots organized by Amelia Earhart in the 1930s. She was recruited by Amelia Earhart personally to be the president of the local chapter of the 99s. Eventually she moved to be an administrative secretary in New York, and while in New York in the late 1930s, the beginning of World War II, she was recruited as a pilot to join the Auxiliary Transport Authority of the Royal Air Force. The ATA were women pilots who ferried the new fighter planes from the factory to the airfields, freeing up men pilots to fly in the Battle of Britain. In May of 1943, an engine of a plane she's ferrying develops an oil leak, freezes up, and she crashes into a stone barn, and was killed instantly, and is buried here. In a moment, you'll see who else is buried down here in an ironic connection to that same event. Yeah.
'Cause I actually, my ex-wife and I bought her house.
Oh my gosh, there
Yeah. that's
she
Mary.
is. There's Mary.
Yeah.
Want to pass that? That is cool. Oh wow, he bought Mary's house.
Yeah.
Wow, there are always connections. It's just unreal. Yeah.
Every Veterans Day, November the 11th, card of appreciation from England shows up on the
Really?
website.
Really? I didn't know that. That is cool. There is a Mary Nicholson chapter of something or other that maintains a website in honor. You Google it, and a lot of information out here shows up. I'll have to come out on November 11th sometime and look for that. It's kind of like, any of you know the legend of, oh gosh, it's why the Baltimore Ravens are called the Ravens. Who was it who wrote the, Edgar Allan Poe. On his birthday or death date, you know, a fifth of whiskey shows up at his gravesite, and nobody knows who does it. Anyway, this is a lot healthier, I think. Wanted to point out the Benfords here, Raymond and Helen Benford, talked earlier about how they were the directors of the CPS camp up in western North Carolina that recruited a lot of workers there to be faculty at Guilford College, including the Faganses and others. He was president of Guilford College for many years, from the late 19-teens into the early 1930s, replaced by Clyde Milner. And their house actually was an old farmhouse, the president's house, that stands where Milner Hall is now. And I remember talking to their daughter, Mary Margaret Benford, who grew up in that house, and said that during the Depression, when the faculty all took third to half salary cuts, and people literally lived off the campus, they were still a farm, that even as the daughter of the president, she would go out in the front yard into the woods, collect berries, make jams and jellies, and out the backyard to the orchards and down to the farm and get butter and milk. They subsisted through the Depression, just living off the campus like that. But anyway, to the Farrells. You'll see the baseballs around here. If you're there in the shade, here you go. The Farrells were members of the meeting. There were 7 brothers who grew up on a dairy farm where Edgewater Apartments is now, on 421 West Market. That red brick house near Stagecoach, that was their farmhouse. And where Western Guilford High School, Edgewater Apartments is now, that was their dairy farm. Now, in the 1910s and 1920s, there was still a Quaker culture, like I grew up in the 1950s and 60s up in Indiana. You didn't play cards, you didn't go to movies, you didn't dance, you didn't work on the Sabbath. So what are dairy farmers going to do on a Sunday afternoon? Well, you got 7 boys, you got a big pasture field, you play baseball. And so they did really hone their skills playing baseball. They played a game of kind of home run derby. One would stand up there at the home plate, which is probably like we grew up with in our farm, with dried cow chips. There were the bases. And one would pitch and the other would hit, and the others would be out in the outfield, and you'd see how far you could hit the ball. And where the ball landed, you put a stick in it. The next batter would try to top that. Well, later on, 2 of those 7 made the major leagues. Rick Farrell's in the Hall of Fame for being one of the best catchers of his era. His brother Wes won 20 or more games, 6 seasons during his major league career, blew out his shoulder. He would be in the Hall of Fame. But for 5 years with the Washington Senators, they were battery mates, pitcher and catcher on the same team. But before that, Wes was pitching for the Cleveland, formerly known as the Indians, now Guardians, and Rick was with the old Washington Senators. Any of you remember the old Washington Senators of the American League? Washington, first in war, first in peace, last in the American League. And this day, Wes is pitching, he's catching, and Rick, who was a terrible hitter but great defensive catcher, hit a home run off his brother. His brother was not amused by this. Stomps the ground, throws his mitt down. Next inning, Wes, who's a great hitting pitcher, hits a home run. As he rounds the bases, crosses home plate, looks down at his catcher brother and says, "Put a stick in that one." But all 7 of them were great baseball players. Now, the thing that I learned from Logie Meacham, who grew up in Woodyside, is that while they're playing their home run derby there on the farm, they really needed more competition. Woodyside had an African-American baseball team. Now, they couldn't get to the majors because of segregation, but they had a great team. I forget the name of it. I think it was they were the Kings or something like that, but they were really good. And the Farrells honed their skills playing with that black team at a time of quiet integration that way. When Rick retired from his playing career, he became an executive with the Detroit Tigers for 45 years, and as such oversaw the drafting of new players. One of the first people he drafted was a catcher out of Woodyside. He knew the quality.
Hey Max, was there anybody else that were brothers that caught and pitched in the major league?
There was eventually. I don't know if but there have been since, but I can't remember who they were. They were the first.
Max,
Yeah.
let me give you this.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Well,
can
thank
have
you.
it for future, and there's articles there.
Oh, neat. Well, thanks
Yeah.
so much. Anything else you could add about Mary?
She was an amazing person.
Yeah.
I did not know that we owned the house until I read this article in the newspaper. Tom Stedman did it,
Huh.
and he went along and then said the family long since moved from 2400 Walker Avenue.
Huh. Wow.
Who knew?
Wow.
Well, I knew that day, but we had a leak in our attic, and when we first moved into the house, and I went running up and cut into the drywall to try to stop the leak, and I found a letter in there that was written to Mary.
Oh my gosh.
So we have that.
Oh wow.
And yeah.
Well, this will be fun. And November 11th, I'm going to come over here. See that? Yeah.
Max, you might want to mention down at Grasshopper Stadium, outside, as you're walking up, I think it's Eugene Street, they've got a bas-relief, sort of placard of the Farrell brothers.
Oh, do they? Oh, cool.
As you're rounding the corner to go into the main.
Oh, there are a couple of really good books about them. One's by a sports writer here about the Farrell brothers of baseball. Another is by Carrie Farrell, Rick's daughter, called Rick Farrell, Knuckleball Catcher. His specialty was his ability to catch knuckleball pitchers. Now, if you know anything about the knuckleball, the pitcher doesn't know where it's going because you take the rotation off of it and it just goes wherever the breezes are taking it. And so it's impossible to catch. And the Washington Senators had 4 knuckleball pitchers. And Rick Farrell was expert at catching them. And I asked Carrie when she came to speak at Guilford a few years ago after the release of her book, again, Rick Farrell, Knuckleball Catcher. I said, did he have one of those outsized mitts like catchers have now for knuckleball pitchers? No, it was smaller than a regular baseball mitt today. He just had that uncanny ability. But anyway.
Yeah, I think one of the Farrells owned a house in Sunset Hills on Market Street, 1905. Market Street, so Tudor-style house and everything like that and stuff like that. So.
And George Farrell, his daughter Bonnie Waynick, had the farm next to Guilford College where that vein laser place is now. And she was the arm candy of Howard Coble for many years. But talking about Quakers and maybe not Quakers involved in World War II, you've probably heard of the Petty brothers, aces in World War II. Their house is over there just off of Yanceyville, owned by parents of Newgarden Friends School student. What is her name? Jane is here somewhere, my wife. But the mother, who is the mother of the family that owns the Petty family? Iden was good friends of their son. She teaches biology at UNCG. Naja. Okay, yeah, Preddies. Yeah, the Preddies were World War II aces. Both died in World War II. and their house is owned by Newgarden Friends School
Really?
parents. Naja is a award-winning biologist down at UNCG. All these sorts of connections. Want to point out over here, real quickly, William and Ruth Coble, whose farm is now Coble Farms, Friends Homes West. I don't see nearby his brother Walter and his wife Anna Coble's graves, but I just learned a story today about his brother Walter, who was a mess sergeant during World War I. And his grandson just told me that, grandnephew, just told me this story this morning. Walter Coble, whose farm is now Friends Homes at Guilford, was again mess sergeant, World War I, famous for his apple pies. He was a great apple pie baker. And one day during kind of a lull in the fighting, in the trench warfare in World War I, he sees an apple tree between the German and American lines. And one of the soldiers volunteers to go over there and get some apples. So he sneaks over there, fills a bag full of apples, and throws it over his shoulder and heads back for the trenches. And a German soldier shoots at him and hits the sack of apples, and he survives. And as Walter Coble always told the story, he said, that apple pie was a hit. I want to point out Pete and Lucretia Moore, right here, Jake Floyd Moore, yeah, and Lucretia. We talked about Clyde Milner's figuring out how to integrate Guilford College, bring Kenyon Quakers. It was really hatched by Pete Moore. Pete Moore knew the international Quaker community. In 1953, Pete had written a letter to the Board of Trustees at Guilford saying it's time to integrate. This is even before Brown versus Board of Education. But again, the board wasn't going to do it because of that chair, Robert Frazier. I hope no descendants of Robert Frazier. No. But he keeps working, and Pete hatches this scheme. If we can go over and recruit 2 Kenyon Quakers in 1962, and that's how Guilford integrated. But the effort started long before that. Now down here,
yeah. Mrs. Meacham on Saturday talked about Lucretia Moore.
Yeah.
Was that in the context of League of Women Voters?
Yeah, League of Women Voters, yeah. She reminds me of Theresa Meacham, who grew up in Woodyside, the African-American community, was close friends not only with Lucretia Moore through the League of Women Voters, but with Betty Holges. Betty McClanahan, where's descendant from there?
They're dropping like flies.
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry. But had very close contact with people here. But I wanted to point out the irony of Mary Nicholson's death ferrying an airplane from the factory to the airfields in May of 1943. If you look at this marker, 4 members of the Knight family, born 4 different times, there's a mother and 3 children, all died on September 13th, 1943. Their farmhouse was out Old Oak Ridge Road near the airfield. A Navy pilot that day was ferrying a new warplane to the airfield. The engine seized up, crashed into their house, and killed 4 members of the family. Same row as Mary Nicholson, same year, same circumstance. Oliver, the father, had just left the house to go down to the barn, saw the plane hit. Cornelia, who many of us know, just died a few years ago, 4 years ago, survived, and her room
on the extremity of the house, and an aunt survived, but 3 of her siblings and her mother were killed. Now Cornelia, again, was the only child who survived. They'd already lost an infant son in death before. Says that her later full life was in large part made possible not only by surviving that, but by her father, who sent her back to Guilford. Her sister was a junior, she was a freshman. And in that culture, in 1943, you could expect the father to say, okay, I've lost my wife, I've lost my children, you're going to stay home with me and take care of me. He said, you know, bad things happen to good people. We can't explain what happened, but you've got to go back to college and get an education. And he sent her back to Guilford, making the rest of her life really possible. Eternally grateful. She hated her name, though. Cornelia is from her grandfather, Cornelius Knight, who was the college farmer. And if you've seen those pictures of the guy in the Abraham Lincoln stovepipe hat on horseback, that's her grandfather, Cornelius Knight. She hated that name. Okay, get in the shade. Yeah, very little shade left. But we might actually make the 2-hour limit, maybe. I want to point out the Woodies. Again, this was the focus of our tour on Saturday. John Woody, like Addison Boren, walked to Indiana at the beginning of the Civil War to escape the Confederate draft. As a graduate of the boarding school, he was then hired to teach in a little Quaker academy, Sugar Plain Academy, just north of Indianapolis, where he met Mary Chawner Woody, another teacher. Both had gone on to get further education. They both read law at the University of Michigan. She had gone to Earlham. He had studied at the Lebanon Normal Institute and met as teachers in that little academy. And as successful teachers, they were then recruited to start a Quaker college in Salem, Iowa. He became the first president of Whittier College in Salem, Iowa. That went defunct in a few years because those Quakers were moving out to the actual Whittier in Southern California and Oregon, where George Fox University, Herbert Hoover's college, was being founded. So they went down to Oskaloosa and started William Penn College, now William Penn University in Oskaloosa. They then came back to Newgarden, recruited to help transition it into a college. So they were here for 14 years, transitioning the boarding school into Guilford College. And during that time, he was teaching surveying. His father was a surveyor, and he'd picked that up. And his students, and there's a picture of that, Theresa knows that picture too, of him with his class laying out what's now Guilford College Road, connecting the old Founders Hall with the train station. And while they were here in the 1980s, they became aware of the fact that blacks were still having a hard time finding landowners to sell them land. And there was already a little smattering of the black community here. Persimmon Grove started in 1882 out along 421, that little AME church. And so they bought a plot of land just on the other side of the railroad tracks at Hibbler, just off of College Road, and made it available for blacks to purchase plots of land, much like Warnersville. And when their son Waldo inherited the remaining land in the 1930s, the old Rosenwald School that served the Persimmon Grove community, and that graveyard is still there on 421 West Market at the overpass there of the interstate over West Market at Stagecoach. That Rosenwald School burned down, and he donated a plot of land in Woody's, in that community the Woodies had bought, to build a new school. There's a picture of it in your brochure, and that's what gave rise to the name of Woodyside. So that Woodyside community is named after those two generations of Woodies. Now they went, after Guilford College, they went on and established Friends University in Wichita, Kansas, and then established Whittier College in Southern California. And then came back here and in retirement laid out Francis King Street near Harris Teeter, and with Franklin Davis, one of the other faculty members at Guilford, built 2 old Victorian houses they lived in retirement, and were involved in establishing Slater Academy, now Winston-Salem State University. And during that time, Mary was active with DeWitt Binbow, Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, Charles McIver, starting Women's College, now UNCG. And working with Binbows, you'll see some Binbow graves over here. DeWitt Binbow, another Quaker, not buried here but at Crown Hill, was instrumental in establishing all the colleges and universities in Greensboro. He was on the board of Guilford College when it transitioned. He helped establish Bennett College in the basement of a church in Warnersville. He resurrected Greensboro College after it burned down with his philanthropic gift and sending his workers over to rebuild it. He brought A&M, now A&T, to Greensboro, and was involved in establishing, as I said, Greensboro College, Bennett College, A&T, Guilford College, and built the first luxury hotel, Binbow House, on the site where Woolworths is now. I mean, just amazing guy. But she was very involved with them. She was also the first president of WCTU in North Carolina, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and just amazing folk, amazing folk.
Hey Max, I got a question.
Yeah.
Where did these Quakers come from that settled here in Newgarden?
The first ones came from southeastern Pennsylvania. The question was, where did the Quakers come from? The first came from southeastern Pennsylvania, late 1740s, early 1750s, down the Philadelphia Wagon Road.
Outside of Philadelphia?
Outside of Philadelphia.
Chester County?
Yeah, Chester County. Newgarden gets its name from the Newgarden meeting in Chester County, right next to Kennett Square. If you know Kennett Square in Chester County, what's Kennett Square known for? Mushrooms. And I don't want to go too far with the analogy, but how do you grow mushrooms? Keep them in the dark and throw manure at them. But anyway, yeah. So
what's the difference between Mennonites, Quakers, and
Hutterites and Amish and Moravians?
That's right.
Okay. Question was, what's the difference between the Quakers and those other peace church types? Well, the Quakers and the Mennonites in Pennsylvania worshiped together for several years when they first came in the 1680s. But Quakers don't have outward ordinances. We don't do outward baptism by water. We don't have outward physical communion. Mennonites do. And so they finally split. Mennonites also have more of a culture of separation from the world. And Quakers followed William Penn's advice to love the world with weaned affections. To be involved with the world, but just kind of keep it at arm's length. But the Mennonites and the Amish said absolute separation. And the Mennonites weren't overly open to women in leadership. Quakers were, and the Mennonites loved to sing, and Quakers didn't. So there were some theological differences.
So what about the United Methodist Church? Did they come out of these organizations?
Nope, United Methodist Church came about 100 years later through a reform movement in the Church of England. John Wesley once said, other than what we said earlier, that only by the grace of God do Quakers get saved, that had it not been for the failure of the early Quaker movement in reforming British society, Methodism wouldn't have been necessary. This was the site of the old yearly meeting house, which was used as that field hospital during the Revolutionary War. So if you were here March 15, 16, of 1781, you'd be surrounded by screaming, dying people. Okay. Just a couple, 3 more if you can hold on.
No, it didn't happen.
Find that shade. I mentioned earlier about how important education was for Quakers. Every little meeting had a school. Because there wasn't public school, Quakers didn't have ordained clergy. Every Quaker had to know how to read, write, have leadership and authority because it didn't have an ordained clergy. And we weren't allowed in the church's schools. The Church of England didn't allow us. So every little Quaker school had its little meeting, had its little grammar school. And this is the site of the first purpose-built school for the Newgarden community. Earlier, schools would have been held in the meeting house or people's homes. On Saturday, it was pointed out that the cornerstones, not the literal cornerstones, but the markings for where that school stood are right here. I had never noticed that before. Maybe because I'm always leading Halloween night tours. You couldn't see it. But there they are. I think you pointed those out. And there it is. Now, I can't believe it was that big. That's as big as the really meeting house. And the pictures you see of the little school don't make it look that big. But was it 2 floors? No, it was just 1 floor. But evidently, somebody thinks that was the outline of that school. But anyway, so this was the site of Quaker learning until the Newgarden boarding school. But very importantly, in 1821, Levi Coffin, that ardent abolitionist, went to local enslavers and said, we're going to open up that school building on Sunday afternoons when we're not using it to teach your enslaved persons how to read the Bible. Would you give permission for them to learn how to read the Bible? Now there's something going on there. One is, it's illegal. It was illegal to teach enslaved persons how to read. We didn't want a literate enslaved population. They could read maps. They could read the Liberator. They could read instructions. And that's why so much of the Underground Railroad was oral and sign language and songs and nails driven in sides of trees and secret knocks and all of that. But Levi and the other Quakers convinced some of the more progressive folks, like David and Rachel Caldwell, that the Bible teaches humility, obedience. Even in the slave culture of the South, preachers used it to justify slavery. And they said, how could you deny the benefits of the Bible to your enslaved persons that have been so meaningful to you and your children? Oh, okay. Well, it was the back doorway of teaching literacy. And it was so effective that within months, that school was shut down by other enslavers who said it was making their enslaved persons restless. And if you take a look at the number of the teachers in that school, they wound up in Indiana. Jeremiah Hubbard became a leader of the Quakers up in Indiana. Elijah Coffin, first cousin to Levi, became the clerk of Indiana Yearly Meeting. Levi winds up there in 1826. Vestal will end our tour with, the first conductor in the Underground, dies the year the Quakers are leaving, 1826. Horace Cannon leaves about the same time as the Borens. Packs up his family. Their farm is where Lowe's Foods is now, off of Newgarden. They get up to Indiana, and their son, Joseph Gurney Cannon, you can see that they were Gurneyites, not Hicksites. Joseph Gurney Cannon was in the first class of Earlham College. And after his graduation, he got a law degree and went to be a lawyer in Eastern Illinois, and serves as the representative from his district in Congress for 46 years. And from 1903 to 1911, he's Speaker of the House of Representatives. Cannon Office Building is named after him. You've probably seen his historical marker down in Battle Ground. There's also a marker on campus. Iron Joe Cannon ruled the House of Representatives with an iron fist, son of Horace Cannon. So pretty significant folk who had to get the heck out of here because of what they were doing. Okay, I know. 2 more places.
Okay.
Yes.
They want to explain the different sects of Quakerism and stuff
Oh.
like that. Just a little bit.
You have 3 more hours?
Yeah. Oh, wait.
Really quick.
Yeah. Good question.
Like every other denomination, there are theological and social and political differences. Indiana Yearly Meeting in 1843-44 actually separated into 2 distinct organizations because Elijah Coffin teacher in this school and first cousin to Levi Coffin, kicked Levi Coffin off his committees because Levi was an abolitionist. Elijah was a gradualist, feared that abolition would destroy the economy. He was a banker. So it's separated into Indiana Yearly Meeting and Indiana Yearly Meeting of Anti-Slavery Friends. So there are divisions that happen. But during that same time, there are theological and cultural divisions that began in 1826, 27, 28 in Philadelphia between the Hicksites and the Orthodox. And it was three main theological issues. The nature of humanity. Are humans perfectible? Do they have that inward light that can lead them into perfection and salvation? Or are they so incapable of that that you need a Savior, a substitutionary atonement who died in their place, and the blood sacrifice saves them? There's a theological difference there between, does the inward light and the presence of Christ within lead you into salvation, or do you need this outward physical act 2,000 years ago? That's one. What's the role of the Bible? Is the Bible the authority, the prime authority by which we organize our religious and personal lives? Or is the Bible a secondary source of authority to that inward light and the presence of Christ, the author, within, who can interpret the Scripture and lead you? And what is the nature of God? Is God the great clockmaker who kind of wound up the universe, then went off to Club Med and was just waiting for us to figure things out? Or is God intimately involved in daily activity? Their enlightenment impacts the rise of the evangelical movement, but largely it was cultural. The conservative friends who wanted to hold on to the old Quaker understandings of the inward light and the secondary nature of scriptural authority were rural, conservative farmers. That was 2/3 of Philadelphia early meeting. The evangelical folk, who were emphasizing new evangelical understandings of authority of the Bible, substitutionary atonement, those evangelical teachings that were rising in the Second Great Awakening and the Frontier Revivals, early 1800s, were the Philadelphia urban power elite. They were the liberals because they were getting these other influences from these other contacts they had. And it was red state, blue state stuff. It was just like North Carolina. Red counties, blue counties, and that kind of stuff. But anyway, it led to all kinds of stuff. Alrighty, two more places. You guys are real troopers. So what I found out very quickly as you pass by the grave of Vance Havner. Remember early on the question was, do you have to be a Quaker to be buried here? Well, Vance Havner is an example of no. You have to be dead, but you have to have a connection. His wife and Allred were Quakers. She was dry clean. When she married Vance Havner, a Baptist, she got dumped and got wet clean and became a Baptist. But because she had those Quaker connections, when Vance Havner died, he was able to be buried here. Now, Vance Havner is significant. Some of you may know Vance Havner. Significant enough that when he died, his funeral down at First Baptist was preached by Billy Graham. He was part of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, but also a very witty author and preacher known for his witticism. One of my favorites was he described most Christian worship in America as starting at 11 o'clock sharp on Sunday and ending at 12 o'clock at dawn. Anyway, that's Vance Havner. I wanted to point out Georgiana Staley Coble. Now, we've talked about the Cobles. Sam Coble, bought the land up here. Her husband, after moving up here from Randolph County, to have access to Quaker education. They were Quakers down there, but they wanted to move into this community where there was better education available. Their sons, Bill and Walter, farmed what are now the Friends Homes communities. Well, Georgiana was Methodist, I think. After the Civil War, you didn't get disowned for marrying Methodists anymore. And she married Sam and moved up here, and she became a Quaker. But her brother, and this is the part I really want to emphasize for those of you who are athletic fans, Georgiana Staley's brother was Augustus Eugene Staley, A.E. Staley, born in 1867. Didn't want to stay in the devastated South on a hardscrabble farm. He wanted to get the heck out. So he went to Baltimore as a young man, became a food starch salesman, corn syrup, stuff like that. Made enough money that in the early 1900s, he went up to Decatur, Illinois, and bought a factory, a food starch factory, and turned it into, at the time, in the 1910s, the equivalent of Archer Daniels Midland today. That was big stuff. And like other mill owners, he had a football team. And the Decatur Staleys represented the brand in playing around in the 1910s. Had a terrible season in 1918. That's not good for the brand. So he said, I've got to improve the team. He learned that there was this recent graduate, an All-America football, baseball, basketball player from the University of Michigan, who'd blown out a knee, so he wasn't going to go pro, but still good enough that he hired him to coach and play for the Decatur Staleys. Young man by the name of George Howland. 1919, they have a great season. And the next year, George Hallis and some of the other mill owners and coaches go off to Canton, Ohio, where they meet and form the National Football League. 2 years later, George Hallis buys the Decatur Staleys and moves them where? Chicago, where they become the Chicago Bears, whose mascot to this day is Staley the Bear. That's the sister.
Wow.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Susan, that is Dolly Madison family, and it's just Quaker, Dolly Madison.
Yeah.
Do you have any family members there?
No. I'll say something about that. Whatever. Good luck finding shade, but you can, if I can yell loud enough, you can get the shade over there. But have hope, we're about done. The question was, Dolly Madison, any of her family buried here? Not to my knowledge. Now, Dolly Madison was born in this community in 1767 or 8 on a farm there between Dolly Madison and Muir's Chapel. I remember talking, any of you remember John White, a member of our meeting? John White just passed away a year or so ago. His grandparents farmed that farm. And he remembers, as a little boy, riding on a tractor with his grandfather, and the back wheels of the tractor fell into what had been her family's root cellar on that farm. Wow. Now, her family were Paynes, P-A-Y-N-E. They'd come down from Virginia. Her father was a minister, an elder, and had been summoned down here to the Newgarden community to take care of kind of refereeing a conflict in the community. And they stayed, bought that farm, and she was born there. 6 months later, they moved back to Virginia. Now she remains Quaker, marries a Quaker, Todd, up in Philadelphia. He dies of yellow fever along with one of their children. And some guy by the name of Aaron Burr introduces her to James Madison, and the rest is history. Yeah. So anyway, thanks for asking. We're finishing up here. There's so much else. I'm sorry it's taken so long, but there's a lot of history here. But I want to end with Vestal Coffin, the way we began, kind of with Vestal Coffin. He was one of those three that helped free Benjamin Benson. He was the first organizer of the Manumission Society in North Carolina, trying to convince people to free their enslaved persons. In 1819, he and Alethea are farming 170 acres off of Newgarden Road, where Captain Clay Edwards, Target, at Temple Emmanuel, Aha, Price Park are now. 170-acre farm. And he is a known abolitionist, as is this community, packed full of anti-slavery activists and abolitionists. So a lot of free blacks were moving into the Newgarden community for that extra layer of protection. Just recently, we unveiled a historical marker on West Market for Vina Curry. She and her husband, Arch Curry, were free blacks who moved into the Newgarden community, had a 12-acre farm on Horsepin Creek, between the Coffin farms, where they grew up. Benjamin Benson, again, winds up down here, assisted by the Quaker community. John Demery was another of those free blacks who moved with his family from South Carolina into the Newgarden community in the 1830s for that extra layer of protection. We don't know where their cabin was, but it was obviously very close to the Coffin's farm because of this story. Winter night in 1819, John Demery's former owner dies, and his sons decide we're going to reclaim our inheritance. John Demery's been freed, and so they come riding into the Newgarden community, find out where John Demery's cabin is located, and ride up to it in the middle of the night, yell out saying, we've been out hunting, we've gotten lost, we need assistance. John Demery steps out of his cabin, and they jump him and start tying him up with ropes. They're going to haul him off, sell him into slavery, reclaim their economic advantage. John Demery's wife comes running out to see what the commotion is, and they knock her unconscious. The daughter comes running out, and before they can hit her, John Demery yells to her, "Run, get Vestal Coffin." So it's obviously pretty close by, because she dashes through the night, finds Vestal Coffin having just stepped outside of their log cabin to get a load of firewood. Here's what the deal is: drops the load of firewood, doesn't grab his winter coat, but grabs a neighbor and dashes back here in time to intercept the kidnappers. And he lets them know, I know how to do this. I've been involved in these legal systems. You're violating the law. You can be sent to prison for this. He's a free man, and this is a violation of the law. And they get kind of spooked. They don't know how to respond to that. And while they're trying to figure out their next move, the neighbor unties Demery's ropes, and he springs into the woods in freedom, with bloodhounds actually chasing him. Well, the kidnappers don't know what to do, so they hop on their horses and hightail it out of there. But they'll be back. So John Demery that night goes to the Coffin cabin to figure out what's my next move. I can't stay here. So they map out the route to Indiana, to Richmond, Indiana, that town established in 1806 by 3 Randolph County Quakers, one of whom is the ancestor of Herbert Hoover, David Hoover. A Quaker town in a free state. And the route is essentially the route the Quakers were taking as they leave the slave South for Indiana in free states. It's up 52, over the Blue Ridge, through southern Virginia to Charleston, then by steamer or foot along the Kanawha to the Ohio, by steamer or foot to Cincinnati, and then up to Richmond. Part of that route is still called the Quaker Trace between Cincinnati and Richmond. 6 weeks later, by foot, John Demery arrives in Richmond, where he lives for 2 years working to earn enough money to send for Sarah and their children, who then join him. Now, until I went to Indiana last month to speak at the Levi and Catherine Coffin Museum, their house is still standing as an Indiana historical monument with a new museum next door interpreting all this history. I thought that was where the story of John Demery ended. I didn't know what happened afterwards. Well, while I'm waiting to talk about Levi Coffin's origins here, because if you grew up in Indiana like I did, Levi Coffin's a product of Indiana. Well, no. He was forged here, and they wanted to hear about that. So before my talk, and it's available if you want to email me, I can send you a link to it. Jane and I are looking around the museum, and there's a map there on the wall of the routes of the Underground Railroad. Oddly enough, at the Levi and Catherine Coffin Museum, the route from Guilford County to Indiana isn't marked. I mean, it's just, I pointed this out. Yeah, I know, it's kind of embarrassing. But anyway, they just gotten that out of some old book. But there on that same map of the Underground Railroad routes were the locations of the free black communities established by those fugitives who got to Indiana and established supportive communities that meant they didn't have to get all the way to Canada, because they had that tight-knit, because you had to get to Canada usually to the fugitive slave law, and you could be chased into free states. Well, there on that map, just a mile or two outside of Newport, where the Coffin's home was the Cabin Creek Free Black Community, established 1825 by John and Sarah Demery. And it just chilled up my spine when I saw it. Now, it's spelled one of the 4 ways Demery is spelled. Down here, it'll be D-I-M-E-R-Y, D-I-M-R-E-Y, or D-I-M-R-Y. There wasn't any standardized spelling back then. Up there, it's D-I-M-O-R-Y. But it's the same guy. So anyway, that night in 1819, 203 years ago, the first conductor, first passenger of the Underground Railroad. It wasn't even called the Underground Railroad yet, because railroads hadn't been invented yet. And he continues to be very active, working with Levi Coffin and others on the Underground Railroad, getting hundreds and eventually thousands out of here. Dies on his birthday in 1826 of consumption at age 34, leaving his wife with a hardscrabble farm and 4 small children. They don't have enough money to get to Indiana. Finally, earn enough money that they pack up their possessions, get in a wagon, and head for Indiana. The roads are so bumpy, she gets out and walks the 450 miles. Gets to Indiana, can't stand it. She's away from her husband, away from the community, so she comes back in 1833 and, farms, does other work, but in 1837, Newgarden boarding school is established, and she goes to work as the matron of the women's side of Newgarden boarding school, where she works with Vina Curry, a free black whose husband Arch had just died. So she's working because she's got a hardscrabble farm on Horsepin Creek and needs work. She's a washerwoman. While she's scrubbing away on her scrub board in the Newgarden boarding school, she takes her husband's free papers, hands them off to blacks who are trying to get to Indiana. And she interviews them while she's over there at the boarding school, washing away. Do you match the description? Are you trustworthy? Because when you take these papers to get to Indiana, you'll be asked to give them to a Quaker like Levi Coffin, who will bring them back here so I can use them again. She gets 15 people out of here on the Underground Railroad, scrubbing away in the old boarding school. Alethea's there with her. Now at the same time, Quakers are getting more and more conservative here and are clamping down on illegal activity. So you can't do that kind of stuff anymore. Vine and Alethea over here, scrubbing away, getting folk out of here. It's a fascinating story. So Alethea then, eventually her children grow up, they all move to Indiana. They keep saying, Mom, you got to get the heck out. There's no future in North Carolina. So she finally packs up, goes to Indiana, and becomes matron of the women's side of Earlham College. And like Emily Levering, runs it like a Marine Corps sergeant because she knows all of their families, because she knows where they all came from in Indiana and North Carolina. And if they get out of line, I know your grandparents, I know your parents, I know your cousins, aunts, and uncles, and they get in line. And finally retires, stays in Indiana, dies in 1891, 65 years a widow, and has returned to be side of her husband. Now he's got an epitaph that kind of goes on and on and on about everyone mourning him. For the longest time, all I could see about her epitaph was died in Indiana. And underneath it, it's buried in her wedding dress. She held on to that dress through multiple trips to Indiana and back, and still fit in it. And if you're walking back and forth to Indiana, you'll fit in it. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm sorry for how long this takes, but this is just the third of it. So anyway, a lot more stories in that book if anyone want to pick that up. I don't know if we'll do the Halloween tour this year because Jane and I are hoping to be in Palestine picking olives. But if we're not, Halloween night at 8 o'clock we usually have a lantern tour that covers some of the same stuff. But, anyway, thank you all so much. Have a happy decoration memorial.